England's most powerful dynasty was born not from royal blood, but from exile, secret deals, and a single act of betrayal that changed history in an instant. The Tudors, power, blood, and betrayal in England's golden age, began with a brutal victory at Bosworth and a family forced to fight for survival at every turn. How did a fugitive son build an empire from the ashes of chaos? And at what cost? The answer begins where all certainties end. Margaret Beaufort's signature was never on a battlefield, but her fingerprints were all over the Tudor cause, long before Henry Tudor set foot on English soil. Hidden behind layers of coded letters, trusted servants, and diplomatic gifts, she built a lifeline for her son from the shadows of exile. In the years after Edward IV's death, as England fractured under Richard III, Margaret's network stretched from the English gentry to the heart of the French court. She brokered promises with Charles VIII, who saw in the young Henry a tool to unsettle England. French loans, recorded in ledgers from 1483 to 1485, supplied Henry's camp with gold, weapons, and ships, each coin a wager on the chance of regime change across the Channel. Margaret's agents moved quietly between Brittany and Paris, delivering coded messages to exiled Lancastrians and secret allies at home. Her correspondence, some preserved in later state papers, reveals careful instructions: who to trust, where to send funds, which promises to make and which to hold back. The money did not flow openly. It passed through the hands of merchants, disguised as payments for wine or wool, then reappeared as wages for mercenaries or bribes to wavering nobles. Every transaction carried risk. Discovery meant ruin for her and for Henry. Diplomacy was just as dangerous. Beaufort's envoys negotiated with the Stanley family, powerful landowners who had survived the Wars of the Roses by mastering the art of delay and double-dealing. She offered them not just money, but a future, land, titles, and royal favor if Henry prevailed. The Stanleys, led by Thomas and his brother William, played their part perfectly. They promised support in secret, but kept their troops apart from both armies until the decisive moment. Their hesitation was calculated, their loyalty for sale to the highest bidder. Richard III understood the threat. He took Lord Stanley's son hostage, hoping to force their hand. But Margaret's promises, and the prospect of reward, weighed heavier than any threat. By the summer of 1485, Henry's invasion force was a patchwork of French soldiers, Welsh recruits, and English exiles, funded, fed, and held together by the invisible threads spun by his mother. The scale of Margaret's operation is clear in the surviving accounts: loans from Charles VIII, payments to Breton ship captains, quiet gifts to English lords. Without her schemes, Henry's claim would have been little more than a rumor. With them, he landed at Milford Haven with the resources to gamble for the crown. The battle at Bosworth would be fought with swords and banners, but the outcome had already been shaped by years of secret diplomacy and the steady flow of foreign gold. August 22, 1485. The fields near Market Bosworth churned with the boots of 3 armies, but for hours, 2 of them simply watched. Thomas Stanley and his brother William, perched atop Crown Hill with 6,000 men, held the balance of power yet kept their banners furled. Richard III, armored and restless, eyed them with suspicion. He had already taken Lord Stanley's son hostage, threatening death for any sign of betrayal. The Stanleys offered nothing but silence. As the sun climbed, Richard gambled everything on a single, brutal charge. Spurring his horse through the marshy ground, he aimed straight for Henry Tudor, hoping to end the rebellion with his own sword. For a moment, the field narrowed to one man's desperate thrust for survival. But the Stanleys' patience had always been tactical. At the precise instant when Richard's household knights became isolated, William Stanley gave the order. His cavalry thundered down the hill, slamming into Richard's exposed flank. The king's supporters broke and scattered under the sudden onslaught. Archaeological surveys of the site reveal clusters of arrowheads and cavalry debris, where the Stanley attack crashed through Richard's line, confirming the chronicler's accounts of chaos and collapse. Richard fought on foot, his crown knocked loose in the melee. Witnesses described him hacking his way through the press, refusing to flee. But the numbers were overwhelming. As he fell, contemporary sources record his last cry. "Treachery! Treachery!" The word echoed across the field, the final accusation of a dying dynasty. Within minutes, Richard was dead, his body stripped and slung over a horse. The last Plantagenet king erased in the mud and blood of Bosworth. On Crown Hill, Thomas Stanley picked up Richard's battered circlet and placed it on Henry Tudor's head. Chroniclers note that the coronation was immediate. No royal regalia, only the spoils of a vanquished enemy. In that moment, the Tudors' right to rule was not written in bloodline, but in betrayal. The Stanley brothers, once kingmakers by hesitation, became kingmakers by violence. Their reward would be vast: lands, titles, and a dynasty beholden to the men who had turned the tide. The message was clear. In Tudor England, power belonged to those who could betray at the perfect moment and survive to claim the prize. Henry VIII was not born to be the tyrant history remembers. In his youth, foreign ambassadors described him as the very image of Renaissance promise: tall, broad-shouldered, and quick-witted. Venetian envoy Sebastian Justinian wrote in 1519 that Henry was the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on, excelling at jousting, tennis, and hunting. The court sparkled with tournaments and music, the king leading every contest with infectious energy. Early portraits show a lean, athletic figure, dressed in bright silks, his gaze direct and confident. Henry's laughter filled the great halls of Greenwich and Hampton Court, and courtiers scrambled to match his appetite for sport, learning, and spectacle. But beneath the surface, the seeds of his later rule were sown. Henry's obsession with physical prowess pushed him into dangerous competitions. Injuries mounted, a twisted ankle here, a bruised rib there, yet none slowed him for long. That changed in January 1536, when a jousting accident at Greenwich left him unconscious for 2 hours. Chroniclers recorded the panic that swept through the palace, fearing the king would not survive. He did, but not unchanged. The wound to his leg never healed properly, and medical accounts from the royal household detail years of swelling, ulcers, and unrelenting pain. Henry's personal recipe book, Sloane Manuscript 1047, lists daily ointments and poultices for his sores, evidence of a body under siege. As his mobility faded, so did his patience. The king, who once danced until dawn, grew irritable and withdrawn. Foreign envoys noted his swelling girth and unpredictable moods. The same man who charmed visitors with his wit now lashed out in fits of rage. Court physicians, wary of royal wrath, left no direct case notes, but the treatments they prescribed grew ever more desperate. Henry's frustration over his failing health bled into his politics. His pursuit of a male heir became a fixation, his trust in advisors thin. Those who disappointed him, wives, ministers, even old friends, found themselves discarded or destroyed. The physical pain that gnawed at him day and night became a shadow over his reign, shaping decisions that would change the course of English history. The promise of the Golden Prince gave way to the wounded lion, lashing out to protect his crown and his legacy. In 1534, Parliament enacted a law that would redefine the very nature of English sovereignty. The Act of Supremacy declared Henry VIII, not the Pope, as the supreme head of the Church of England. This was not just a religious decree, but a legal revolution engineered by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, and one of the sharpest legal minds of his age. Parliamentary records from that year detail heated debates and the careful wording Cromwell crafted to ensure royal authority was absolute, leaving no room for papal interference or noble resistance. Cromwell understood the machinery of power. He used the king's need for an heir, and the mounting frustration over his leg wound and declining health, as leverage to push through laws that made the king's will inseparable from God's law. The Sloane manuscripts contain entries describing Henry's daily rituals, ointments for his ulcers, prayers for a son, showing how personal suffering and dynastic anxiety drove the king to seek control over both body and soul. With every act of Parliament, Henry's private fears became public policy. The Act of Supremacy was more than a statement of faith. It gave Henry the legal right to seize church lands, dissolve monasteries, and redirect their wealth to the crown. Cromwell's legal strategies turned centuries of tradition on its head, dismantling the old order and replacing it with a royal theocracy. Official records show how swiftly monasteries fell. Within a decade, over 800 religious houses were closed, their treasures inventoried and carted away under royal seal. The king's signature, once limited to matters of state, now reached into every parish, every pulpit, every conscience in England. Those who refused to recognize Henry's new authority faced a stark choice: submit or be branded traitors. The legal machinery Cromwell built was relentless. Trials for treason became swift and unforgiving, with Parliament statutes providing the justification for executions that followed. In the span of a few years, the English monarchy was transformed into a theocracy, its reach enforced not only by swords, but by statutes and seals. The Act of Supremacy made law a weapon of personal will, binding the entire kingdom to the king's conscience, and to the ambitions of those, like Cromwell, who could wield the pen as ruthlessly as a sword. The king's new authority came at a heavy price. Beginning in 1536, royal commissioners swept through the countryside, shutting the doors of more than 800 monasteries. Ledgers from the Court of Augmentations record the vast flow of seized wealth: gold chalices, silver plate, acres of farmland, funneled straight into the crown's coffers. For generations, these religious houses had been more than places of worship. They offered shelter to the poor, care for the sick, and education to local children. Now, entire communities found themselves turned out overnight, their livelihoods erased by a few strokes of the royal pen. Monks and nuns were forced to sign oaths renouncing their vows. Some received small pensions, but many wandered destitute, their former homes stripped bare and sold off to loyal courtiers. The king's violence was not limited to distant abbots or silent friars. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn, once the queen who had inspired Henry's break with Rome, became the latest casualty of his need for control. Arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, Anne's downfall was swift and public. Trial records show a court packed with her enemies, and evidence assembled by Thomas Cromwell that would not have survived scrutiny in any modern court. Anne's fate was sealed before she set foot in the Tower. On May 19th, she knelt on the scaffold, praying for the king who had turned against her. The executioner's sword fell, and with it, the last hope of reconciliation between Henry's personal desires and the old order he had destroyed. The cost of reform was measured in blood as well as gold. Financial accounts from the period reveal the sudden enrichment of the crown, but also the sharp rise in payments to jailers, executioners, and informers. The machinery of state violence grew ever more efficient, silencing dissent and making examples of any who resisted. The king's will, now law, swept aside centuries of tradition. In the ruins of the monasteries and the silence left by Anne Boleyn's execution, the message was unmistakable. Survival under the Tudors meant obedience, and the price of defiance was death. Edward VI entered the world as the long-awaited male heir, but his reign began in the shadow of his father's ambitions and ended before he could claim adulthood. At just 9 years old, Edward was king in name, but real authority belonged to those who controlled the council chamber. First among them stood his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who styled himself as Lord Protector and governed with a mix of reformist zeal and personal ambition. Somerset's government moved quickly to reshape England's religious life. In 1549, the Book of Common Prayer became law, replacing the Latin Mass with English liturgy. Parish records from that year show confusion and even riots in Devon and Cornwall, where communities resisted the new forms. For many, the changes felt like an assault on centuries of tradition, imposed by distant men in London. Edward, earnest and pious, kept a careful diary. His entries reveal a boy fascinated by sermons and scripture, yet often isolated from the world beyond his tutors and counselors. In one entry, he notes the execution of his uncle Somerset almost as a matter of routine. The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off upon Tower Hill at 9 o'clock in the morning. The cold brevity of his words hints at a court where affection and loyalty counted for little. After Somerset's fall, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick and later Duke of Northumberland, seized control. Dudley was no idealist. He understood that the boy king's authority was a mask, useful for pushing through policies that favored his own power. Under Dudley, the pace of Protestant reform accelerated. Church interiors were stripped of images, altars replaced by simple tables, and the doctrine of transubstantiation officially abandoned. The Privy Council's minutes from these years read like a checklist of transformation, each decree tightening the grip of reform and deepening the rift with traditionalists. For Edward, the changes were both personal and political. Letters to his tutors show a young king convinced he was leading a godly nation, but the reality was more complicated. The council's policies sparked open rebellion, the Prayer Book Rebellion in the West, Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk, forcing the government to deploy troops against its own people. The violence of suppression left scars in local chronicles, with reports of hangings, burnings, and confiscated lands. As Edward's health declined, the question of succession became urgent. Dudley, ever the strategist, persuaded the dying king to draft a new devise for the succession, one that bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Lady Jane Grey, Dudley's own daughter-in-law. Edward, convinced this would secure the Protestant faith, signed the document from his sickbed. But the ink was barely dry before the council's plans began to unravel. The boy king's reign, driven by the ambitions of others, left England more divided than ever. Its faith unsettled, its future uncertain, and its throne once again the prize in a game of power and betrayal. Smoke and the stench of burning flesh drifted through the streets of London as Mary I set about reversing her brother's Protestant reforms. The Queen's signature, written in a trembling hand, authorized the first executions in early 1555. Over the next 3 years, more than 280 men and women, scholars, artisans, even a handful of humble farmers, were condemned as heretics and burned alive. Public execution warrants, preserved in the state archives, reveal the machinery behind these deaths: names, locations, charges of denying the real presence in the Mass. Each warrant bore the weight of Mary's conviction that England's soul could be saved only by fire. Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain, brokered in 1554, deepened the sense of crisis. The union, intended to secure a Catholic dynasty, instead fueled suspicion and unrest. In Kent, Sir Thomas Wyatt rallied thousands in open revolt, denouncing the Spanish match as a threat to English sovereignty. For 2 weeks, panic gripped the capital. Government troops deserted, Londoners barricaded the gates, and Mary herself, unflinching, addressed the city from Guildhall, swearing she would die a Queen of England and a Catholic. The rebellion collapsed at the gates of London, its leaders captured and executed. Wyatt's head was displayed on a spike, a warning to any who doubted the Queen's resolve. The aftermath was merciless. Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister, was arrested and interrogated, suspected of complicity, but spared the axe through lack of proof. The government's paranoia, stoked by the uprising, found its outlet in the heresy courts. Bishops Latimer and Ridley burned together at Oxford. their ashes mingling in the fire. Archbishop Cranmer, who had crowned Mary's father and shaped the Protestant prayer book, was forced to watch his friends die before facing his own pyre. His final words, recorded by witnesses, condemned the Queen's cruelty even as his flesh burned. Mary's policy of restoration was not just a matter of ritual and doctrine. It was a campaign to erase her father's legacy and her brother's brief revolution, using terror as both warning and purification. The burnings became a spectacle. Crowds gathered at Smithfield and elsewhere to witness the flames. Letters from foreign ambassadors described the horror and fascination of these scenes, while Protestant exiles abroad published lists of the dead, turning victims into martyrs. The Queen's determination to root out heresy left scars that could not be healed by prayer or penance. By the time Mary died in 1558, England was exhausted, its faith battered, and its wounds still raw. The trauma of her reign would haunt the next monarch, shaping the delicate balance between conscience and survival in the years to come. Elizabeth I stepped onto the throne in 1558 surrounded by uncertainty. But within a decade, she had transformed her court into the beating heart of a cultural renaissance. The Queen's presence was a spectacle in itself. Her progresses through the countryside drew crowds who waited for hours just to glimpse her golden robes and jeweled collar. Every appearance was carefully staged. Records from the 1560s and 1570s show a calendar packed with masks, tournaments, and public sermons, each one reinforcing the myth of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. Patronage became her most effective tool. Poets, musicians, and playwrights flocked to London, hoping for royal favor. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser thrived under this climate, their works echoing the ideals of loyalty and national pride. Royal accounts detail generous grants and invitations to perform at court, while guild records reveal a boom in theater construction and music commissions. The Queen's own tastes shaped the era. She favored allegory and flattery, demanding that every performance reinforce her image as both ruler and muse. Elizabeth's court was a stage where every gesture carried meaning. Portraits from this period show the Queen surrounded by symbols: pearls for purity, the Tudor rose for legitimacy, the globe for dominion. Visitors from abroad described her as both dazzling and inscrutable, able to charm ambassadors with wit and then freeze them with a single glance. Behind the pageantry, the Queen's mastery of soft power was unmatched. She distributed honors and access sparingly, keeping courtiers in a constant dance for her approval. Nobles vied for the right to organize festivals or sponsor poets, hoping to bask in reflected glory. The records of the Revel's office and the Lord Chamberlain's accounts show how tightly Elizabeth controlled these displays, ensuring that every song, play, and pageant served her monarchy's image. In the world outside the palace, the illusion of harmony and prosperity took root, masking the anxieties that simmered beneath the surface. Francis Walsingham watched the world through 1,000 eyes. In the corridors of Whitehall and the taverns of Antwerp, in the crowded streets of London and the candle-lit chambers of Catholic safehouses, his agents listened, wrote, and reported. Ledgers from the late 1580s list regular payments to codebreakers, couriers, and informers, entries marked only by initials or cryptic code names. Some sums went to mathematicians, hired to break ciphers, others to prison guards who smuggled letters out of dank cells. Walsingham's expenses were buried in the royal accounts as Secret Service money, a phrase that would echo through centuries of British intelligence. The machinery of Elizabethan espionage was both simple and sophisticated. Letters between conspirators arrived written in cipher, hidden in the stoppers of beer barrels, or sewn into the linings of doublets. Walsingham's cryptanalyst, Thomas Phillips, sat for hours over these slips of parchment, transcribing rows of symbols into plain English. In 1586, a sequence of intercepted messages revealed the Babington plot, an assassination scheme aimed directly at Elizabeth. with Mary, Queen of Scots, as its hoped-for beneficiary. Philippe's marginal notes, deciphered by Philippe, still appear on the surviving documents, alongside the forged postscript he added to draw a final, damning answer from Mary herself. The records show the scale of the operation. Over 50 corps agents worked at Walsingham's direction, with dozens more paid for occasional intelligence. Payments for deciphering sundry letters appear alongside expenses for invisible ink and bribes to foreign couriers. Walsingham's network stretched from the Scottish border to the courts of Spain and France, always hunting for the next whisper of treason. The Babington letters, decoded and presented as evidence, sealed Mary's fate and exposed the machinery that kept Elizabeth's throne secure. In this world, trust was a liability, and betrayal, carefully documented, paid for, and filed away, was the currency of survival. February 1587. Mary, Queen of Scots, stood in the Great Hall at Fotheringhay Castle, surrounded by commissioners and silent witnesses. The warrant for her execution, signed in ink and sealed by Elizabeth's council, lay on the table. Mary's final words, recorded in the official account, were a prayer for her soul and for the forgiveness of her enemies. The axe fell, ending not just a life, but a threat that had haunted England for decades. In the days that followed, diplomatic couriers raced across Europe, carrying news of the execution to Catholic courts. Spanish ambassadors denounced Elizabeth as a usurper and regicide. In Madrid, Philip II's resolve hardened. The death of a Catholic queen demanded retribution. The following year, the Channel filled with sails. The Spanish Armada, 130 ships strong, advanced in tight formation, their decks crowded with soldiers, priests, and banners bearing the Virgin's image. English warships, outnumbered but faster, harried the Armada from Plymouth to Calais, firing at distance and refusing the close combat the Spanish favored. Naval dispatches from Lord Howard of Effingham and Sir Francis Drake described the frantic days of pursuit. Powder running low, men exhausted, but morale unbroken. On July 28th, English fireships packed with pitch and gunpowder drifted into the anchored Armada at Calais, scattering the Spanish fleet in panic. The battle off Gravelines the next day shattered the Spanish formation. Wind and storm drove the battered ships north, around Scotland and Ireland, where dozens foundered on rocks or were wrecked by gales. Private letters and royal proclamations cast the defeat as divine deliverance, but the reality was a blend of English seamanship, artillery, and the relentless force of weather. Fewer than half the Armada's ships returned to Spain. In council records, Elizabeth's advisors debated the risks and rewards of Mary's execution. In the aftermath, the victory over the Armada silenced doubts. The Tudor state had survived its greatest test, proving that power sometimes demanded the hardest choices, and that survival itself could be the sharpest weapon in a world built on blood and betrayal. Debate over the Tudors has never faded, and the sharpest voices often belong to historians who see both triumph and tragedy in the dynasty's legacy. John Guy argues that the Tudors transformed England from a medieval kingdom into a modern state, but at the cost of what he calls rivers of blood and relentless betrayal. For Guy, the dynasty's achievements, centralized government, religious reform, cultural flowering, are inseparable from the violence that made them possible. He points to the records: executions ordered by Henry VIII, the burnings under Mary, the surveillance state built by Elizabeth. Each advance, he suggests, was paid for in lives and trust. David Starkey, in contrast, sees the Tudor period as a kind of national performance. He describes Elizabeth's court as a stage, her reign an artful illusion, a dazzling display that masked secrets, surveillance, and calculated ruthlessness. Starkey's analysis draws on Privy Council minutes and ambassadorial letters, showing how the outward show of pageantry and order depended on constant vigilance and the suppression of dissent. He warns that the Golden Age was built on fear as much as hope. Both perspectives circle the same truth. The Tudors built a powerful state, but the cost was measured in blood and suspicion. Their story remains alive because it forces us to reckon with the price of progress and the shadows that power can cast. Centuries after the Tudors vanished from the throne, their story refuses to fade. New discoveries in archives and archaeological digs keep rewriting what we think we know, from the unearthing of Richard III's bones beneath a Leicester parking lot to the digitization of Henry VIII's personal letters. Each find draws fresh crowds to exhibitions, eager to glimpse the world behind the legends. The Tudor Age has become a global brand, fueling best-selling novels, blockbuster films, and streaming series that transform kings and queens into household names. Museums report record attendance for shows featuring Anne Boleyn's jewelry or Elizabeth I's signature. University presses race to publish newly decoded state papers, while geneticists analyze remains for clues about royal health and succession. The dynasty's blend of power, blood, and betrayal still fascinates, shaping everything from school curriculums to fashion runways. In the public imagination, the Tudors are more than a family. They are a mirror for questions about ambition, faith, and the cost of greatness. Their echoes ripple through popular culture, proving that the pull of their story is as strong now as it was 500 years ago. In 1485, Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field signaled the start of a new dynasty, forged through political intrigue and battlefield betrayal. The Tudor reign saw the closure of over 800 monasteries under Henry VIII, the execution of rivals and kin, and the rise of a surveillance state under Elizabeth I. Parliamentary acts, trial records, and ambassador reports document a relentless pursuit of power, often at immense human cost. Yet, despite official records and the writings of figures like John Guy and David Starkey, key motives behind decisions such as Mary Stuart's execution remain debated. The fate of personal correspondence and certain council records means some truths are still lost to history. The Tudor legacy, centralized monarchy, religious upheaval, and a fascination with authority continues to shape how England views its past. The evidence reveals a dynasty built as much on blood and betrayal as on vision and reform.